I'm Rebecca Rear, Director of the Climate for Health program at ecoAmerica. And while we're all tuning in virtually, I'm hosting from just outside of Washington, D.C., on land shepherded by the Nacotchtank and Piscataway people. I'm excited to get into today's topic, Mothers Know Best, Practical Advice for Climate Action, with our fantastic guests, Veronica Butcher, Executive Director of Mothers and Others for Clean Air, LaTisha Harris, Community Organizer with Mothers Out Front, and Tracey Holloway, Gaylord Nelson Distinguished Professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Thanks so much to all of you for being here today. First, I want our listeners to get to know each of you a little better. So I want to ask what motivated you to work on climate solutions. Veronica, let's start with you.
Well, I started working on climate change in the late 90s, early 2000s. I studied a little bit about it in school, but then I went off and had a career in the violence against women's movement for a number of years before coming back over working on environmental issues. And at that time, as a field organizer in North Carolina, I was out in rural counties talking to people who really had never heard of it, didn't understand what it was. There was a lot of questions and denial, that we still hear some today. But over the years, for me, it was the human aspect, because I'd worked with trauma victims for so many years. And then when I came over and was working in the environmental movement, I saw that I was actually using my skills as a rape crisis advocate, as a trauma response advocate, more than any other skill as an organizer in the field, because people who were dealing with very real impacts from climate change, flooding and tornadoes and fires and things like that, which gets lost, I think, so much in the conversations.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned it, actually, just from the start, because I was listening as a prep for this conversation today. I was listening to a new podcast that's out there called Hot Mamas. And they talked a lot about the wildfires in California, and how that, it was a turning point for some of the action that folks are taking in California. And actually, speaking of California, LaTisha, why don't you go next?
So I got into the environmental movement accident. One of the organizations that I was working for was awarded a project from the Strategic Growth Council. They were investing over $70 million into 2 zip codes within our city. One of the zip codes that I live in and I've grown up in, lived in for nearly 40 years of my life. And so with that being said, the reason why we were getting the funding, it's a great thing to get the funding, but we were getting the funding because we have some of the worst air quality in the nation and some of the highest asthma rates and poverty in the nation. And so it kind of sucks to have the worst. And so they invested that money into 2 of the zip codes. Again, like I said, one that I still currently live in. And with that being said, learning how climate change was affecting my pregnancies. I've had 3 pregnancies and I've experienced preterm labor with all 3 of my pregnancy complications. And by no doubt, I believe it was because of my community. I often say my community was killing my pregnancy. And then 2 of the 3 of my children actually have asthma. So learning that, I do believe the proverb, we don't inherit the earth from our ancestors, but we borrow it from our children. And for that very reason is the reason why I got into the movement and why I continue.
Wow, thanks. And that theme has come up before on this series. We had when we co-hosted an episode with APHA, we learned about a native proverb that talks about 7 generations. We hear, that you're looking to preserve the earth 7 generations in the future. And I'm sorry if I'm misquoting that, but it was a really moving quote about, that we want to preserve the earth and make it better. Like, I think it's, people talk about preserving and sort of keeping things status quo, but let's make it better, right? Tracey, how did you get into this to climate work?
Well, it's so interesting to hear about Veronica and LaTisha's path into this issue. Mine is much nerdier. I majored in applied math in college and wanted to go and do research in graduate school. And I went to Princeton University to study the atmosphere. And I was thinking about weather prediction and hurricane tracks. But actually, as you start to study the atmosphere, you cannot understand what's happening even with weather prediction without thinking about it in the context of climate change, how things have changed over the past decades and centuries, what's happening now, and what's predicted for the future. And so working in a scientific research lab really helped me understand what a big issue this is, why it's based in the facts and very sound science, but also that if you want to solve the problem, you can't just solve it by tweaking variables in a model. This leads to changes in society and our energy system. And so after my PhD at Princeton, I was hired here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison as a professor. And actually, I was hired through an initiative in energy. They hired an electrical engineer and a nuclear engineer and a policy guy, and they hired me because environmental issues are such a big force shaping our energy transition now. And so now here at the University of Wisconsin, I do research and teaching connecting energy, climate, air quality, and public health. And one of the big activities I do is leading the NASA team that makes satellite data more relevant to decision making. Again, kind of this theme of how does science support real world decisions. And the other part of my work is doing a lot of analysis of solutions to climate change and how these same solutions can be win-win for public health, for air quality, and for the economy and other aspects of our day-to-day life.
That's really interesting. I like, I mean, everyone has taken quite a different path, but I love that we're all here today, sort of in community, and I think that a lot of the research that ecoAmerica has done has shown that, majorities of Americans are concerned about climate change, but not as many folks think others around them are concerned. And so it's really interesting to hear the way that your paths have brought us here today, and that we are in community and working on this together because we care. And actually, the next question is, we started the description of this episode with the age-old saying, listen to your mother. So I'm wondering, how do you talk about climate change with your kids, or how, as a mom, have you made changes to your life to be more climate friendly? LaTisha, why don't you go first?
So some of the things that I've done, again, like I said, I still live in the zip code that I grew up in. I live in the same neighborhood, literally maybe 5 houses down from my parents. And at the time, I thought it was the best for me, being a single mother of 3. It was a great investment. Let's buy a home down the street. Mom can help. But again, like I said, as I began to learn and grow, there were things that I realized growing up that I saw. This isn't normal. This isn't right. So on the way to driving my son to school, my 8-year-old, he's the one that has asthma the worst at this time. I began to explain to him, you see this factory, it doesn't belong here. You shouldn't have this, and you shouldn't have to live next to this, or you shouldn't have to go to school next to this. So mommy's going to find you another school. We do talk about that. We talk about the effects of environmental or of climate change and what we can do at home, how we recycle. The one thing that I got him into was recycling, because he would like to go get the extra money. And so he was excited about the little $10 or $12 that he would get. We go buy a toy, but then I was able to explain to him why we were sorting the cans and the bottles. This is really, I know you're getting the money from it, but this is really why we're doing this. This is not just about you getting a new toy and you've done work, but this is so that you have a greater environment, so that when your children are born, they don't have asthma like you do. So it's just the simple, practical conversations with them to help them understand. Even recently, we have embarked on a campaign to fight another industrial plant placed less than a mile from our home. And so him being able to watch the Zoom meetings, being able to watch mommy fight and advocate and speak out against it. He sits oftentimes behind me. He's at school right now. That's why you won't see him. But oftentimes he'll pass by and he'll pop in. And I know that he's just being funny, but he's learning. Those are teaching moments for him to say, no, we don't just allow this to happen. We fight for what's right.
Yeah, Veronica, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you talk to your kids about climate change, or what changes you've made?
That's funny, LaTisha. I turned my camera off just a second ago because my son came. I was like, wait, you're supposed to be in science class. What are you doing? He's grown up. My son is 8.5 now, and he's grown up going to the Hill with me. I used to work with Mom's Clean Air Force for a number of years. So ever since he was born, he would go with me every summer on the Hill. And we would bring his friends along. So, he's grown up again, and especially now with the pandemic too, like he's really seen and heard the work. And, I'll be in the kitchen making his lunch, and I'll have, the meetings on, the conversations and everything. But the other thing is, here in North Carolina, we have a lot of climate impacts. We have a lot of flooding, not from major like hurricanes, but just we're having more heavy rains and severe thunderstorms. So there's a lot of flooding. There's a lot of hurricanes, more severe, more tornado warnings than we've ever had before. In the mountains where I grew up, I'm in the Piedmont of the state now, but where my family is, wildfires are still an issue as well. And so I tell him the stories of like what it used to be like, and that it used to not be so hot all of the time, and in January and December, 80, 90-degree days, or that, you wouldn't start sneezing every year as early as you're sneezing, and it doesn't last as long. But the disaster plans have been the hardest thing, I think, as a mom, like really just wrapping your brain around, like, how do you prepare your kid for, like, if we, because we had one with Hurricane Florence, I thought about evacuating. So having an evacuation plan, having a tub of stuff ready. I've got a tub that I just can grab and throw in the car at any point in time. We've had so many tornado warnings since he was born. Every year they get more and more frequent. This year, we've already had a number of tornado warnings, not just watches. Like, we got to run and get in the closet. And the closet's like, this is under the stairs, closet right behind me. So we put up fairy lights, and he's got his little toys in there and stuff that makes it not feel so scary. But it's so normal for him, where for me, it wasn't growing up. I think gardening has been something else I've done a lot with him. I want him to be connected to nature. I want him to be connected to his food. I want him to understand how it grows. I want him to have that respect and awe and appreciation, because I think when we don't have that, then we see what's happening now in the world. We don't have that, innate call to protect it. And then books. I mentioned this to you. So I have a stack of books here, and I'll just show him really quickly. Ever since he was little, so A is for Activists is a great book. I highly, for a board book for little kids. And all of the nature books, there's tons of them. Like the National Geographic has great series and stuff. But there's, board books made from, this is all recycled. So you get them when they're little. And then, because I always have to rock and appreciate Mom's Clean Air Force founder, wrote a book, Every Breath We Take. And I would take this for Earth Month, and I would read this to his class in preschool and kindergarten. And then as he's gotten older, we've grown, Magic School Bus is great. I recommend. There's a climate change book now that he's older that we actually have, like, it's more, he's a science kid too, surprise, surprise. And then he's got these like renewable energy books that you can get from like the school book fair. But when he was little, he actually got scared of this book, so I had to quit reading it for a little while. But The Trouble with Dragons is a kid's climate change book, if you don't know about it. And the dragons are humans, and it has a warm, fuzzy ending at the end. But I would definitely say a little bit older. I started reading it to him when he was like 2 or 3, and I was like, okay, he was a little too early for that. But there's a book from, we're part of Our Kids Climate, and we have some international partners. And this is a book that was written by one of our partners in Africa, James the Steward, and it talks about how they're dealing with it gives the story from the kids' perspective of the flooding that they're experiencing in other parts of the world. So I'll stop there.
I appreciate like the real tools and recommendations. I'm also glad you both mentioned how involved your kids are in advocacy already, and that whether it's sort of a passive learning or active, bringing them to hearings or the Hill. Some folks who listen regularly know this, but I'm a former lobbyist, on the state level in Maryland, and when we would partner with Mom's Clean Air Force on the, in the what we called, the Little Hill, the state capital in Maryland, you could get into people's offices that otherwise probably wouldn't let you in if you didn't have a kid with you. So I think if folks are comfortable, the more you can involve your kids in advocacy. I know we'll talk about advocacy a little bit later, but it's very effective. People are really willing to have conversations with you if you're, there with your kids in ways that they actually might not otherwise be. And the outcomes, the results are really interesting, that what you learn through dialogue with folks who otherwise maybe you wouldn't chat with. So that was definitely a very memorable experience from many years ago. So Tracey, what about you?
Well, first, I love all those book recommendations, Veronica. Some I've seen before and some are new, but I'm going to have to go back and make a list. So I've been a scientist for over 20 years, and I have two kids. One is 11 and one just turned 1 year old. So kind of a big age gap. And, I think that for me, I have always been very much into, work-life balance, and to leave my work at the office and to try to be totally present as a mom. But over the past year, I've gotten involved in a program called Science Moms. And Science Moms is a group of 9 moms who are also climate scientists like me. And we have been thinking about how to activate the public, especially moms, around climate, how to empower moms with information to get involved in the discussion, to have a voice, and whatever they want to do with that voice, whether it's taking action in their school or talking to their legislatures or community groups. But climate is something that so many people, parents, moms care about, but very few people talk about it. So I'm so happy we're having this conversation today. And the Science Moms program is trying to get information to moms in a lot of different formats. There's a really cool Instagram feed and funny videos and kids' book recommendations, some that overlap with yours, I think, Veronica, and books for moms, because, we're not always reading to our kids. Sometimes we're reading for ourselves. So just trying to put a lot of information on different channels in a way that's accessible, fun, digestible. And so one thing I'd recommend anyone here who's listening, going to sciencemoms.com. There's just a wealth of information, and it's a beautiful website. So I've been involved with the Science Moms program as one of the advisors to the program, one of the spokespeople for the program. It's a nonpartisan effort, which is very much in line with my role as an educator, scientist, and public servant. But that has really changed how I've thought about being a mom and a scientist together. These are not two different hats, but they're one part of everything I do. And the more I started thinking about it, the more I realized that actually I haven't been leaving my work at the office when I work with my kids. I've been, especially for my 11-year-old, engaging with him and trying to highlight science and nature and understanding how the world works. We go to science museums all the time, read tons of books on science and nature, and empower him to be a problem solver. And one thing I often hear is to say, gosh, our kids are really going to have to solve the climate problem. And what I want my kid to get the message, and all kids really, is that no. This is not your problem that we're just going to make worse until you hit age 22 or whatever, that this is our problem that we are working to fix, so that when you look back at the 2020s, you'll see that we turned a corner. And, so I think that there's empowering kids to be problem solvers in part by seeing what we're doing. And just like LaTisha and Veronica have said, having our kids see what we're doing and know that we're out there trying to make the world better for them. And, I know we all have little connections and big connections to air quality. And in 1970, the US founded the EPA, passed binding resolutions with the Clean Air Act, and had the first Earth Day. And if we look back at a lot of environmental issues, they turned a corner in 1970 and started getting better. And I would like our kids to look back at the 2020s and say, this is when we turned the corner.
Yeah, definitely. Let's hope, right? And actually, we are starting to get some audience questions, so keep them coming. But we got a question that's related to what we were just talking about. Winona from Missoula, Montana asks, how do we help our communities move from worrying about personal actions to system change and broader civic engagement. We at ecoAmerica often say that there are so many things that you can do from the moment you lift your head up off the pillow to the moment you put your head back on the pillow at night to go to sleep. There's so many things we can do in our own lives, like things we have control over, things we can talk to our friends about, but it really is about, that is an important element of this. But there's systems change that we all need to work towards. And so just sort of wanting your perspective on that. So Veronica, why don't you start?
Well, I think that personal stories is the most important thing that we can all focus on. I think we get caught up in facts and stats way too much, and then it starts the arguments. I think, we're humans, we resonate with the storytelling, and, we have to connect the personal health impact that people are suffering from. They are physically suffering, mentally suffering. Our children's grades are suffering. We know air pollution is affecting our entire body. It affects our brain and leads to neurological disorders. It's affecting pregnancy and birth. It's affecting our lung health as well as our heart health. In our students, our kids' academics are also being impacted when within a quarter of a mile of a major highway, we see test scores dropping. So I think that telling the narrative and telling the story of how people are getting sick from air pollution, we find at Mothers and Others for Clean Air, is the most impactful way, because most people don't know, because it's invisible, and they don't understand that the smokestacks or the tailpipes are actually making people sick. And then I think the other thing is that they're not connecting the dots that these chronic health issues, diseases, asthma, COPD, lung cancer, all of these things that lead to severe health bills and health costs, that they're connected and they're solvable, and it doesn't have to be this way. So I think for me, when we talk about systems change, it is going to the school system and getting involved with your PTA, because the PTA has a children's health policy platform, and saying, we've got to clean up these diesel buses. We know diesel is awful for our kids, and we know that air pollution exposure is equivalent to smoking cigarettes. So we're putting our kids on the bus every day, and they're basically smoking cigarettes all the way to school. That's not right. We've got to stop that. And the school systems have a huge role to play with electrifying buses, dealing with the carpool idling lines, which have gotten out of control, and how we site schools. We're building them way far out. We're building them bigger. We're creating the need for all this transit to school, and then creating traffic and air pollution problems in places that didn't have it before. We've got to get back to smaller, more community-based schools that are walkable and more sustainable. So I think systems change with school is huge. I think hospitals, there's a role for medical professionals to play. We have a short documentary film we're going to screen next week on the 26th. We released it last fall, called Planet Prescription. And one of the pulmonologists that we highlight in the film, he actually had been a pulmonologist for 30 years, and until he met us, had never thought that air pollution was affecting the management of his patients' care. And he talked about how the grand round trainings in the hospital systems are not teaching not teaching about air pollution. They're not teaching about climate change and health impacts. The journal clubs that the doctors have, that's like their book club, they're not reading the journal articles and having discussions about it. And so if you're a healthcare professional out there, that's a system change right there, that internally that you can do.
That's so important. So many things that you said struck a chord with me. We just bought a new house, and we live in the DC area. So there's the Beltway, and the belt, it's everywhere, right? And you're either inside or you're outside the Beltway. But that was a consideration, because as a woman of childbearing age, right? If my mom might be listening, and she's probably like, yeah, when, I looked at, I wanted to buy a house that was more farther from the Beltway, and there were many houses for sale near the Beltway. And I looked at maps, and I measured, because I know, having done my education in public health with a focus on environmental health sciences, that women who are pregnant near highways, do have adverse birth outcomes at a higher rate. And that weighed heavily on my home buying decision. And I think, telling that story, and you're all, I know we're broadcasting, but you're all making me so comfortable that I'm sharing, but that those personal stories, I think really do move the needle and help shape that systemic change that we all need, because, I'm one person, but everybody needs to have access to safe housing. And that should include distance from, major roadways. So I think I have many other thoughts that are ruminating, but LaTisha, why don't you pick it up from there?
I do agree with everything that Veronica said. However, sometimes I believe that people just don't know. Like I said, I grew up in this neighborhood and I didn't know that. I thought it was normal that factories were down the street. I thought that was normal. I thought it was normal. And it's a selling point that your home is easily accessible to the freeway. You don't know that it's killing you. So I think a lot of times things can be solved with education, simple conversations, taking to your social media, optimizing that, maximizing that opportunity, just posting a quick, whether it's TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, posting a quick video for 30 seconds to say, do you realize how this is affecting you? Especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, it has affected us even more. We're realizing the health disparities, the disparities in our healthcare system. So just a few minutes of sharing your story, sharing why you're passionate about it, sharing why people need to be involved and what they can do to get involved, I think starts the bare minimum. But also not only that, linking with other organizations, because one person can't fight climate change alone. One person, you're one finger, that's the way I see it, you're one finger, but a whole hand, that's a whole fist, you ball it up and you have a greater impact. So partnering with one of the organizations so that you can assist with determining different policies that you need to fight against, legislation that you need to recommend or support, approve. Also voter education, because a lot of times of the policies that are enacted or the legislation that we see is because someone failed to vote. If we simply would have known what to vote on, if we knew how to vote, what it meant, what a yes vote meant, what a no vote meant, voter engagement. And also helping to get those, I call them climate champions, elected, those that will help our environment rather than hurt our environment. We have to get those elected as well. Otherwise, we will continue to see the cycle go on and on and on.
Yeah, Tracey, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with LaTisha and Veronica. And, to me, one of the ways to move the conversation toward the systemic change is to highlight that actually it's a win-win, that in many ways our lives will be better or maybe no different if we're having a clean energy system, if we're cutting carbon emissions, if we're making our air cleaner. And I mean, most people who turn on a switch in their home, they do not know or care where the electricity is coming from. They just want the lights to work and their home to be warm and cool and to be able to plug in their phone to charge it up. And so the question is, why not be getting that electricity from clean sources? And clean sources have gotten cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. One of my colleagues here at Wisconsin, Greg Nemeth, recently wrote a book, How Did Solar Get Cheap? Because it has gotten so cheap so fast that it's almost like, how did they do it? And what can we learn about other clean energy technologies like batteries that can move us in that same direction? And to me, highlighting the solutions is a way to be getting everybody on board, because it highlights the economic opportunities, the job opportunities. I loved LaTisha's story about her son earning some money by recycling, because the truth is, if even, he had as a new job because of environmental concerns, there are so many jobs that could be booming with more investment in clean energy. So to me, one of the things is to move away from the sacrifice narrative, because for some people, yes, that will definitely engage them. It's something I can do. I can eat less meat. I can keep my air conditioner not quite so cold. There are things the individual can do. And if that is what is engaging you and making you feel like you're making a difference, awesome, that is making a difference. But we can't totally rely on those individual changes, because it puts a lot of guilt on people's shoulders that gosh, do I drive to school or do I bike? I mean, what do I do? And so I think that, highlighting that the systemic change that we need is also systemic change that is a win-win. And Rebecca, to your story about the freeway, if all the vehicles on that freeway were electric, there would be zero emissions coming from that freeway, and it wouldn't be noisy either. So maybe a little bit of noise, but if you've ever been around an electric vehicle, it's so quiet that you wonder, like, where is it, you know? And so this idea, I mean, major auto manufacturers have committed to moving in an electric direction. I think just this week, there's a Ford pickup truck coming out that's an electric vehicle. So I think the idea that these changes are moving, they're good for society, they're good for the environment, but they're good for the economy and good for the individual too.
And if I
Rebecca,
could just, oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to add something in regards to systemic change. One of the things that I think we also need to focus on is investing in our disadvantaged communities, because although solar has become more affordable, we have families that can't even afford their energy bill, where the over 50% of their those that are on fixed incomes, 50% of their income is going towards the energy bill. So investing in our disadvantaged communities, because regardless of how affordable and how many new EVs we have and how affordable solar becomes, if I can't afford it, I just can't afford it. And so I'm going to automatically revert back to the practices that are counterproductive to what you're doing. So regardless of how many people we have EVs, if we have those that can't afford to get into the EVs, it's almost counterproductive. So one of the things looking systemically is focusing on our disadvantaged communities, how we assist them, whether it's through resources, education, or finances, to help them also keep up with the change as well.
Well, and I just want to respond to say 100%. I totally agree. But I think though, one thing to keep in mind is, you know, investing in solar doesn't mean that we all have solar panels on our house. It means that the companies that are providing electricity, like we don't have our own coal-fired power plants, we don't need to have our own solar panels, but the companies where we're paying our electric bills, they need to be moving in that direction. And many of them are, but not all of them. And I think, you know, this idea that like, yeah, that there are though some costs that like buying a refrigerator or deciding what kind of car to buy that are borne by the individual. And so I think recognizing that there's some of the changes that the individual can't control and that benefit everybody, but that in many cases there are absolutely needs to invest in, you know, communities that have been overlooked and are the most vulnerable to climate impacts.
And I'll just say for renters too, because I think that's a lost part of the conversation is that, you know, we're talking about buying, and there are a lot of people who rent that don't have control over the appliances or how their home is weatherized or not. And I saw earlier, thank you to Jess for posting our healthy indoor breathing toolkit. You know, those of us who are calling for energy efficiency as a solution to climate change and to reduce energy burden, we have a moral and ethical obligation to make sure we're educating people about the indoor air quality issues. It can often be more toxic than outdoor air. So we have to be careful there, right? That we don't rush so fast to solutions and we seal everybody into toxic environments. Mm-hmm. But I also want to highlight, I see Dr. Jennifer Barkin from Mercer University in the chat here made a comment about the material needs to be integrated into curriculum at medical schools and nursing schools. And absolutely agree. Dr. Barkin's on our panel next week for the film screening I mentioned. And what I've been learning about this is that it's about the tests. We're not testing for licensing when it comes to health professionals on air pollution and climate change health impacts. So ultimately, we need to change the testing system to then change the curriculum and what is taught. And I think that goes across any of the professions that we could talk about today, but specifically, I wanted to make sure we didn't miss Dr. Barkin's comment there, because that's a really great system change that would be a huge change in the tide in this country if we could do that.
Yeah, and actually, I'll just jump in to say, you know, one of the problems with teaching about air pollution as a professor who teaches about air pollution a lot is that many of the resources out there are so technical. It's an upper level course in chemistry or an upper level course in engineering. And I think like having more resources to make air pollution, and yeah, there's some chemicals you have to keep track of and understanding the difference between carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide. But the truth is, I think that there's a lot of ways to make this into a 1 week unit that could be in part of an environmental health class in a way that empowers, you know, practitioners, health practitioners, teachers, you know, citizens to have the information they need to engage in these topics and not feel overwhelmed.
Yeah, and we, we incorporate our Let's Talk Health and Climate guidance into our ambassadors training. So we're hoping that more health professionals, if it's not through, formal degree granting education programs, there are a lot of trainings that folks can participate in, like our ambassadors trainings, and definitely one of our communications tips. So, get into personal narrative and telling your story, and how health professionals are trusted messengers on climate, and they need to be more active, on climate solutions. And that's, and one of our communications guidance points is ditch the doom and gloom. Tracey, to something you said earlier. But that really, the first thing people usually hear about climate impacts is negative. And how can we really talk about, opportunities? Because the thing is, like LaTisha was saying, about cost, we talk about the cost of how much would this policy cost? How much is it going to cost to implement? We already know what the cost of inaction is. We see it play out in our communities, and that, so we know what the inaction is costing us billions of dollars. And so to implement solution actually is a cheaper option and is a win-win. And by, looking at the health burden on communities where there's polluting facilities, or where there's highways where there are polluting cars, that is real dollars. And we need to have that be a larger part of that conversation to understand the true cost of dirty energy and climate pollution. And so, we've started to talk about this, but let's, talk a little bit more about, health being at the root of climate justice. So just each of you to talk a little bit more about how you are incorporating health equity and climate justice into your work. So anybody is welcome to go first.
I will start. One of the things that, again, like I said, we live in the zip code with some of the highest asthma rates in the nation. 1 in 4 African-American boys are plagued with asthma. 2 of them live in my home. So having that conversation, I know one of the principals at our school was questioning, why do all of my kids have asthma? Because they're missing all of this time, and that's learning time that they're missing. Not only is it learning time, how much money are we spending for them to do the emergency room visits or the doctor visits and all of that? I'm going to have to simply explain to him, this is the reason why. So having that conversation, a simple conversation of tying their what they're struggling with to climate change. Here it's asthma, somewhere else. And we can even take COVID-19 and seeing the effects of COVID-19 and the disparities in the healthcare system. So having the flat out conversation, sometimes we don't want to talk about certain things because we don't want to badmouth someone, or we don't want to turn the wrong person away. But the truth, if it's the truth, we just got to face the ugly truth. Another thing that I use very typically here, or very frequently here in California, is called the CalEnviro screen. And it's actually an interactive map where you can type in your zip code, you can type in your address, and see the pollution burden. You can see it's an amazing tool. And so I oftentimes have people here type in your address and see what your pollution burden is. Now let's tie that to a lot of the health impacts that you're facing. Let's walk down your family line. Who has this? Who has that? Who suffers from heart disease? Who has suffered from preterm labor? Who has children that have passed away? Who has children? Like literally tying the issue, the health issue, to their family so that they can see the bigger issue. This does affect me. This isn't something that's somewhere else where there's tornadoes. No, this affects me here.
And maybe I'll just follow up on that, because the CalEnviro screen is so cool. And you're absolutely right that that is an amazing resource. And I think getting information to people so that you can look and see what's going on in my zip code. Now, one of the problems, though, is that California is very unique in the United States and really around the world for having so much data on what is in the air, what chemicals are we breathing, and how is it changing in space and where you are. Most parts of the United States are, a big city might just have a couple of air pollution monitors, and there may be no monitors over wide areas. So then you just don't know what's there. So back to your point, Rebecca, about what we're doing is, I think, the good news is that the science is catching up, to the needs of communities, to know what they are breathing, what they are emitting, how their choices are affecting the environment, and how they're being affected by the environment. And one way is NASA satellite data. I mentioned I lead the NASA team to try to make satellite data and other data more relevant to public health organizations. And we work with city health departments, community groups, the World Health Organization, the EPA, and we're trying to understand how should this like cool space-based data be used to be useful, because it's not just put it up on a website, there you go. It really is like, how can you link it into a program like Cal Enviro Screen? How can you help other areas that don't have as much data benefit from the eyes in the sky that are satellite data? So I think, there's also kind of a big movement now around low cost pollution monitors. This Purple Air is one of the biggest companies where, instead of being $100,000 to put in a monitor, it's $200. And so, I think that there are trends going on, but I think what's driving it is the need to think about equity, environmental justice, ensuring that underrepresented or communities and communities at risk and communities of color are front and center with all of the decision making related, whether it's regulatory decision making or voluntary decision making or climate or air quality, that we just think about the health of disadvantaged communities as a major part of the conversation.
Now I'll jump in and add the EPA has an environmental justice screening GIS tool that is really robust. And I really encourage everyone to go in and check it out. There's multiple layers. You can look at traffic, school proximity, you can look at hazardous sites. So I would also check that one out. We're also looking at air monitoring in the Southeast. It's interesting you brought that up. We've had a year-long partnership with ecoAmerica to look at the gaps in monitoring across the Southeast. We've also been learning a lot from communities about what we know, what we don't know about monitoring, lessons learned from communities that got their own monitor, installed it, collected their own data, went to fight a permit, and had the state tell them that they didn't have an approved monitor and all the data was rejected. So we're going to be doing some stuff, rolling out some stuff and leading some conversations in the Southeast around how do we come together in the Southeast around air monitoring. So I'm really glad you brought that, because that's a huge health equity and concern. We've had these state governments defund their state environmental offices in North Carolina, and we saw, a huge reduction over 10 years of funding and staff. So really being able to and in removing a monitor, we even had bills passed to remove air monitors in certain parts of our state, because if you're not monitoring it, there's no problem to go out and deal with, right? There's nothing to enforce. So I think that we are at a critical point where we're shifting from this, and this is another system thing, the government system being in charge of monitoring and protecting our health, to it being on us as citizens, and more citizen science and community monitoring programs are going to need to pop up and be resourced. So one of the things we do at Mothers and Others for Clean Air is we are trying to build the capacity of those community groups by doing all the research and putting together the materials and resources they need to do their work more effectively, and connecting them to the researchers. So we have an online resource hub that has all of the research at the intersection of air pollution, climate change, and health. We have a specific section dedicated to environmental racism and school communities as well. So in all of the trainings we do for medical professionals or for school communities, we talk about these issues and health equity and environmental racism as a core part of leading with it, not just it being a slide. We're working with the Georgia PTA. We're presenting this summer with them to talk about, under their health policy platform, shifting to electric buses. And they did a lot around retrofitting diesel buses and no idle campaigns in the past. So we're hopeful that Georgia PTA and other PTAs might follow and help us lead that call on protecting children's health in that way. We also did, last summer, we have 10 states in our Southeast region that we work with. And for each state, we profiled each state, the history and of environmental racism in that state. the researchers who are doing the work and the groups that are doing the work on environmental racism in each of those 10 states. So if you're in the Southeast, you can go check that out and find groups to get involved in. We're also developing, we've got toolkits and social media friendly graphics and handouts and things that are for our partners in the Southeast to use to do their work. And the film was a big thing. We're screening the Planet Prescription film. So we're doing one next week for Clean Air Month, but then groups are using that. And that has all health professionals in the Southeast telling the story of air pollution and climate change impacting health, especially our most vulnerable communities.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you mentioned enforcement too, because I think a lot of times we focus so much on passing laws or regulations that incorporate environmental justice and health equity, which is critical, but it's on both ends. We have to make sure that those laws are being enforced equitably and that people are, not just spared harm, but access equitable benefits that are created from the laws and regulations in place. So really appreciate that conversation. And I know that the new administration is putting some federal frameworks in place that we can really ramp up locally as well, like their EJ40 initiative, or that the funding and the some of the funding generated should go to at least 40% environmental justice communities and communities that have been disinvested. So it's a good frame, a good start, but we really need to make sure that gets implemented on the local level as well. And I think making sure that the new administration is also staffing up, right? And not just paid staff as part of the departments, but also in their scientific advisory boards. And Tracey might not mention this, but she's up, she's one of the nominees for the KSAC, the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee. The Scientific Advisory Board is also, both of those boards right now have their nominations up. And you can make public comment on them to recommend folks join those, and those are advisory boards for the EPA that end up, helping craft these regulations. And it might sound a little wonky, but it's really important that we have, that we have scientists, that we have folks who are focused on health equity and public health in general. Health is often underrepresented in those conversations and represented on those boards. And that folks who focus on environmental justice are part of all of those advisory boards. So just giving a little plug there to weigh in on that's an opportunity, right now.
No, I appreciate that, Rebecca. In fact, I just found out this morning that I was on the short list for the Science Advisory Board as well as for the Clean Air Science Advisory Council. So sort of two different boards. But, I've been trying to get the word out for this opportunity for the public to weigh in. Not so much like vote for me, because, if I'm selected, I'll very, very happily serve. But there's so many great people who are on that list. I mean, it is an amazing lineup. And I think whatever you feel like some of the issues that you care about are, you can kind of do a word search through some of the bios to see, where people are coming from, what kind of work they've done in the past, who they've worked with. And, it's I think, like you're saying, a really powerful way to be shaping the conversation, because the Clean Air Science Advisory Council is the senior advisory group to the EPA on air issues. The chair of the Clean Air Science Advisory Council is on the Science Advisory Board. So there's a little bit of overlap there. But yeah, I think, I'm juggling a lot, really busy with a baby and a middle schooler and all this other stuff. But I feel like I would go in a heartbeat to be part of these conversations, because it is so important. Back to the systemic change, so much systemic change relies on what's going on in Washington. Not all of it. There's so much at the neighborhood level and the community level, but they're all working together at different scales. And I think that, we all have to join in where we can have an impact.
Yeah, so if you're listening and you're interested, comment on that, but also look into what other advisory councils there are. There's National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, the Children's Health Protection Advisory Council. There's a lot of ways to get involved and have your voice heard as part of the process. So I know we're approaching time. So I have a penultimate question and then a lightning round question. So quick answers to this one, because I want to make sure we get our audience questions. So Matt from Concord, New Hampshire asks, what is the best way to deal with misinformation on the left and right around climate and health impacts? So challenge here to you. to answer this quickly. How are you dealing with misinformation?
Well, for me, one of the things that I try to do is just to clarify that my only role is to tell the truth. And I think it's awesome that there's A is for activist and a lot of activists on both sides. But I think also feeling like there are places to go. And I think universities are one, schools are another. There's a lot of websites like NASA has so much information on climate change, that these sort of reputable, middle of the road sources that you can say, we may disagree on what to do, but let's try to get to a common understanding on the facts.
Yeah, I think myself focusing on the facts had an issue recently where we had one of our nonprofit organizations, very notable, talk about natural gas and how great it is because it's natural. It's clean gas, literally. And I had to explain to them, and I didn't call them out particularly, because we don't want this to turn into a war. We have so many other battles that we can fight, but also just kind of saying, okay, this is what natural gas is. This is what it does. This is how it's harming our communities. This is the impacts. And this is what's going to happen if we continue fracking in California. So kind of taking the positive approach, not necessarily attacking the individual or the organization, but representing what the facts are.
So I actually come from a very conservative family, and what I think a lot of people get lost in with the media perceptions of this is that all conservatives don't care about the climate, and that's just not true. I learned about conservation and recycling and caring for the earth and gardening from my dad. And we don't agree on all political issues, but my love of the earth and caring for the earth came from my very conservative upbringing. I don't consider myself a very conservative person anymore. I'm definitely middle of the road, but I think we have to listen when we hear people who are disagreeing and there is misinformation, and we need to ask questions to them to really understand what is it for them. And the more we listen and let them talk, the more we can really understand what the root is, and then come back in with an approach that's more caring and loving and not so hard. I think oftentimes, especially if we're talking about family members or personal friends, not complete strangers, it gets harder, I think, when it's complete strangers. But I think in all my years of talking to elected officials and talking to people, standing at a table with a petition in rural North Carolina, asking people, to take action on climate, it really was trying to listen and understand where their doubt came from, or where their concern came from, or where their mistrust came from. And then for me, I think the facts are very important. I think it's, again, personal stories for me seem to resonate the most with folks, and asking simple questions about, like, well, were the summers this long and hot when you were a kid? Or can you remember the winter being so short? Or do you remember, do you remember hurricanes this much, or tornadoes this much, or flooding this much, or whatever it is, right? And I think, or like asthma, allergy season so long, like asking people those questions and then letting them tell you their story helps bring them along faster. And I'll end that comment with, we've got to respect people where they're at on their journey too. If you attacking people and shutting people down isn't getting us anywhere, and it's no longer a debate. So it's just not worth our time and energy. I think we just need to love people where they're at and ask them the right questions and listen, and then give them, what they need on their journey to get to where we're all going.
I mean, that's, mothers know best, right? So that's, I think that's great advice. So I really appreciate everyone's time today. I think we have one more lightning round question, so like 30-second answers. So many of our goals must be accomplished within the next 10 years to make sure we maintain a habitable planet. So let's fast forward. It's Mother's Day 2030. What are your kids thanking you for?
I'll go if nobody else has one. My son is going to thank me that his children are not riding diesel buses to school, or sitting in idling carpool lanes, or in the car 30 minutes to get to school and back.
My 8-year-old thanks me today for a Tesla. So I'm sure, yes, he thanks me for a Tesla today. But I think they would be thankful for water conservation because California is facing a drought, as well as being able to breathe.
Those are so good. I think in 2030, I will have a 10-year-old and a 21-year-old. And I think they'll have different things they're thanking me for. I think that my 21-year-old will be thinking about, like, learning about these big issues, historical context. And I hope he's understanding how much has changed in the 10 years before he got there. So I hope he is getting a big picture perspective where he can be like, holy camole, we were not going in the right path and now we are. And I hope my 10-year-old, that he doesn't have the kind of hypothetical question of, would you rather settle on Mars or fix the environment on Earth? This was literally a short discussion question. And, but this type of discussion question, it's fun, it's fine, it doesn't offend me, but this is not the kind of thing we should be like, our kids shouldn't have to be mulling over whether they'd rather be on Mars or fix the environment. Like, that's not a great framework that they should be growing up in. And so I'm hoping my 10-year-old, just feels like we are on path and things are getting better.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you so much, Veronica, Tracey, and LaTisha, for joining us as our guests. We are grateful for the words you shared and the work that you do. We're at the end of our time here today, but I know you have inspired our listeners to act on climate and to improve our health and our family's health. For all our listeners, please click on the link to the survey when this webcast ends to provide your feedback. If you're watching this on YouTube, check out the description below to let us know what you think. Engage with us online with the hashtag Let's Talk Climate, and be sure to subscribe and follow us for the latest thought leadership, resources, and episodes on climate action and advocacy. Join us next week on Thursday, May 27th for the Let's Talk Climate episode, Sacred Home, Creating Shelter, Building Resilience, and Living Carbon Neutral, with our Blessed Tomorrow director and faith leaders. Our next Climate for Health episode, Disabilities and Disasters, A Path to More Inclusive Climate Solutions, will be on June 17th. Sign up for the Climate for Health newsletter so you don't miss a beat. From all of us at ecoAmerica and Climate for Health, thank you. Please join me in caring for our health in order to care for our planet. Stay well, stay safe, and see you next week.